here's where we are on the brink.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the three key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
That was Tito Benito talking about the massive success of taking out Iran's nuclear facilities across 3 different nuclear sites. Now, whether the mission was as successful as he claims is still an open question. You have tons of reporting across foreign and even domestic sources indicating that really nothing was done in terms of delaying the Iranian nuclear pursuit. Let's keep in mind that this whole sequence of events has only occurred because of Trump's ego getting in the way in his first term and eliminating the nuclear agreement that Barack Obama, along with a number of other countries, had negotiated and had set up. So taking all of that into account, and we'll come to some of this a little bit later, how did we actually get here? There's a lot of different ways that you can answer this question. If you zoom out, we are here basically because of over 100 years of meddling in Middle East affairs. And when you think about the US foreign policy, this has been part and parcel of the US foreign policy for almost its entire existence. But specific to the Middle East and Iran in particular, there was almost a direct handoff from British meddling in Iranian affairs to the US meddling in the Iranian affairs. When you look at the story of Iran, you have a nation that's sandwiched between 2 different imperial powers in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. You have Russia on one hand, who is seeking to gain influence within Iranian territory, and you have the British, who are also looking to gain influence within Iranian territory as well. All of that shifted with the Bolshevik Revolution. When that happened, Russia was in a state of chaos, and the British saw an opportunity to expand their influence within Iranian borders, specifically with the interest of expanding their oil interests through British Petroleum. When you start looking at the domestic affairs of Iran, you have several shifts that happened over the course of several decades. For a period of time, as the British were setting up the infrastructure for British Petroleum and the oil interests that they had within Iranian territory, there came a point in time where Iranians actually wanted to audit the revenues that were being generated from the oil industry. When the British refused to do a full and comprehensive audit, the Iranians threatened to nationalize the entire oil industry so that the Iranian people could benefit more from the revenues that were being generated. By the 1950s, British refusal to open up the books and take a look at what was happening with Iranian oil revenues led Iran to elect their own leader, Mohammad Mossadegh. And part of Mossadegh's platform or initiatives was to nationalize the British oil fields so that Iran could benefit and Iranian people could benefit from the oil industry. Now, this was something that the British refused to do and refused to deal with. So the British, in conjunction with the US and particularly the CIA, installed the Shah of Iran, who was more Western friendly and extremely repressive to the Iranian people. And you fast forward to the Islamic Revolution of Iran, you have decades of interference by the US and the British it came to a head. And the Islamic Revolution led to the Ayatollah taking power. And now Iran has gone from a pro-Western puppet government to an extremely anti-Western religious fundamentalist state. You can make the argument that all of this happening in the Middle East and in Iran would have never happened if, as many people have said, Western powers had just minded their own business and stayed out of the international affairs of other countries. But we know that historically, this has never been the case. You have centuries of British interference all across the global South, and then they passed the baton after World War II to the United States to handle that same sort of interference. Anywhere where you're looking at the global South, whether it's Africa, whether it's Asia, whether it's South America, American and British fingerprints in the toppling of governments and the creation of completely dystopian failed states that benefit the West because that makes it easier for Western corporate interests to basically steal as many of the resources as possible and turn the global South into an extraction source for resources that the West needs to live in the comfort that they've become accustomed to. When it comes to this pattern of behavior by the British and by the United States, this is pretty consistent. You can look through the history of the 1900s, you can look through the history of the 1800s and see the interference that has happened at the hands of both of these imperial powers and the damage that it's caused to the global South. When we ask the question, how did Iran become public enemy number one? The top reason that you have to point to is repeated interference and meddling by the United States. And you've seen that happen throughout the entire Middle East. Think about all the different countries that are propped up by US interests and Western interests. Every single one of those countries at one point or another had a leader in place that was at some level supporting US interests. And when the US decided that it was inconvenient to have these people in power, they went to another regional power and created issues. The Iran-Iraq war is a perfect example. You have to keep in mind that before the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein and that regime that was in place in Iraq was a US ally. In fact, the war between Iraq and Iran was largely funded by the US through overt and covert means. And there's even evidence that indicates that the US funded both sides in the hopes that it would create permanent chaos to the benefit of the military industrial complex and defense contractors that the US relies on. When you think about the US's history, for a country that often talks about the beacon of freedom, this is a country that has in effect been waging war almost its entire existence. There is roughly a period of 12 years where the US hasn't been at war with some country or another and hasn't been meddling in some other foreign affairs. When we think about it, this pattern of dishonest communication is part of the American tradition. As much as the American tradition involves meddling in foreign affairs, the American tradition also involves a level of delusion where American leaders will continue to parrot propaganda that says that they are doing this in the interests of peace in the region. How many times have we heard throughout the years that we don't have an issue with the people of X country, we have an issue with the government of X country, and that's why we're bombing that particular nation, as if the bombs only impact the leadership of that country. The US has done such a great job of propagandizing to its people that these precision strikes hit the ears of the general American public as if it's some sort of video game, that these are completely targeted with no collateral damage, with no wreckage that happens to civilians, and none of that actually exists. You've seen evidence of this doublespeak even in this regime's leadership.
What we've said to the Iranians is we do not want war with Iran. We actually want peace. But we want peace in the context of them not having a nuclear weapons program. And that's exactly what the president accomplished last night. I really think there are two big questions for the Iranians here. Are they going to attack American troops, or are they going to continue with their nuclear weapons program? And if they leave American troops out of it and they decide to give up their nuclear weapons program once and for all, then I think the president has been very clear. We can have a good relationship with the Iranians. We can have a peaceful situation in that region of the world.
JD Vance gives a perfect example of American propaganda when it comes to how they communicate their unauthorized and unwarranted attacks on foreign nations. You heard what JD Vance said. We want peace with Iran. That's why we're bombing them. How ridiculous does that sound? And what we have to understand is that all of these actions are setting the stage for a repeat of what happened in the Second Gulf War. We've seen all of this before. Remember the language that came out of the post 9/11 era. Here's George W. Bush talking about his worldview in the post 9/11 aftermath and how he justified his illegal war that dragged us into a 20-year foreign adventure.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people.
When we listen to all that, we need to listen to it with a critical ear. Here we are talking about the message of freedom and democracy, and all the while throughout our history, we've propped up every sort of dictator around the world who completely savages their people, but the resources keep coming to American corporate interests, and it feeds the capitalist engine that drives America. And the mythology of all of that is that we're driving freedom through the world and we're making our standard of living in the US even better. But what have we noticed for the better part of the last 50 years? The only people getting rich are the top 1%. And in fact, if you look at the most recent 10 years, the top 1% has increased their wealth by over $30 trillion. What's happened to the rest of us? Where have the bottom 90% been? And you've heard me talk about how the bottom 90% has experienced a $50 trillion transfer of wealth to the top 1%. Perpetual war enables for that to happen. Now, when we look at what's happened in the Middle East over the last 40 years, we have to be honest about what is driving that. Certainly, American military interests and energy interests are driving a lot of it, but there's also the fact that this plays right into the agenda that Benjamin Netanyahu has wanted to have happen for almost that same amount of time. In fact, here is a montage of Benjamin Netanyahu basically making the same argument since the 90s about Iran being an imminent nuclear threat.
The deadline for attaining this goal is getting extremely close. And Iran, by the way, is also outpacing Iraq in the development of ballistic missile systems that they hope will reach the eastern seaboard of the United States within 15 years. By next spring, at most, by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb. The foremost sponsor of global terrorism could be weeks away from having enough enriched uranium for an entire arsenal of nuclear weapons. That would place a militant Islamic terror regime weeks away from having the fissile material for an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs.
If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months, less than a year.
So what you've heard is Benjamin Netanyahu singing the same song in the same verse for a period of almost 40 years. And he finally was able to have somebody dumb enough to fully act on his behalf. Now, you had Kamala Harris tell you exactly what was going to happen if Donald Trump got in power. Every dictator around the world would love to have Trump in power because he is too stupid to know that he's being manipulated. And what just happened? Trump did Netanyahu's bidding and brought us to the brink of World War III.